Charles I to kill a king is one sentence you won't hear in everyday chat about the monarchy. Yet in this period of history, one man decided to go it alone. It would be to his own detriment an eventual fall from grace. A man who relied upon himself to do the right thing at the risk of losing all others' support around him. So which flaws in his character were to blame? And was the demise of Charles just a collection of misguided advice from others, or a totally mistimed selection of errors on his part? Join me now as we look at the life of Charles Stuart. The second son of King James VI of Scotland and Anne of Denmark, Charles was born in Dunfermline Palace at Fife on the 19th of November 1600. He was baptised by David Lindsay, the Bishop of Ross, and created Duke of Albany. Charles was said to be a fragile and a frail infant, and when his parents and the rest of his family departed for England that year, he remained in Scotland with his father's friend Alexander Seton, the first Earl of Dunfermline, who had been appointed as his guardian. By 1604, when Charles was around 3 years old, he was able to walk the length of the Great Hall at Dunfermline Palace without assistance. In mid-July 1604, Charles was said to be fit enough to travel to join up with the rest of his family. He left Dunfermline for England, where he was to spend most of the rest of his life. Upon arrival in England, Charles was placed under the charge of Elizabeth, Lady Carey, the wife of courtier Sir Robert Carey, to assist with his walking. It's said he was put into boots made of Spanish leather and brass, which would help support him when he walked. But his ability to speak was also slow. Charles had a stammer, and this would be with him throughout the rest of his life. Over time, Charles overpowered his physical frailty to the point where he became a great horseman, marksman, and even a very adept fencer. Yet his public persona was some way below that of his brother, Henry Frederick, the Prince of Wales, whom Charles adored and attempted to emulate. In 1612, sadness fell upon Charles when Henry died at the young age of 18. Typhoid was suspected. It was this single act that thrust Charles into the spotlight. He was now heir to the throne. In 1613, Charles's sister Elizabeth married Frederick V, Elector Palatine, and moved to Heidelberg. Then in 1617, the Habsburg Archduke Ferdinand of Austria, a Catholic, was elected King of Bohemia. But the following year, the Bohemians rebelled, frustrating the Catholic governors. It would be settled in August 1619. The Bohemians selected Frederick V as their new monarch. Ferdinand was now elected Holy Roman Emperor in the imperial election, but Frederick's acceptance of the Bohemian crown in defiance of the Emperor marked the beginning of the turmoil that would develop into the 30 Years' War. The conflict soon spiralled out of control into a wider European war, which the English Parliament and public quickly grew to see as the beginnings of a holy war between Catholics and Protestants. In 1620, Frederick V was defeated at the Battle of White Mountain and was forced to give up land due to an invasion by the Habsburg force. For King James, this was good news, as he had been planning a marriage between Charles and Ferdinand's niece, the Habsburg Princess Maria Anna of Spain. It would also quite possibly become a means to achieving peace throughout Europe. England and Spain were never really on the same page when it came to negotiations, and this was one that had clearly grown unpopular with the public, but also within James's court. You can only imagine the reaction from Parliament at James' hopes to nullify hostilities towards Spain and Catholicism, for they wanted a return to Requesens laws, a naval campaign against Spain, and a Protestant wife for Charles. One new measure brought in by James was impeachment. This was the first time it had been used since 1459, and it set a precedent, as the same sanction would be used against Charles and his supporters later in life. But by January 1622, James had become angered at the way Parliament was focusing on the issues, so he dissolved it and described their attitudes as impudent and inflexible. In February 1623, Charles and George Villiers, the first Duke of Buckingham, who was a royal favourite and had great influence not just with Charles but the whole court, was sent to Spain to attempt an agreement on the marriage King James had wanted so much. But it ended in stalemate. The Spanish were, well, let's say, not the biggest fan of Charles. They said he was an infidel, and if there was to be a marriage, he would have to convert to Catholicism. But it didn't end there. Upon their arrival back in England, and without his new wife, The public feeling was one of relief, yet for Charles it was one of disappointment. More than that, actually. He, along with Buckingham, now pressed King James to declare war on Spain.
James agreed and recalled Parliament in 1624. His plan was to raise enough monies to go to war. What could stop this trio of getting what they wanted? Impeachment was used again, this time on the Lord Treasurer Lionel Cranfield, the first Earl of Middlesex, who opposed war on grounds of cost. James seemed to gather his thoughts and told Buckingham and Charles that they would both live to regret the revival of impeachment as a parliamentary tool. James was now becoming increasingly ill, and he found it tough going in keeping overall control, and the young whippersnappers of Buckingham and Charles were now assuming power behind his back. It would be in 1625 that James died.
Spain were now out of sight and mind for Charles and Buckingham, so their eyes turned towards France. On the 1st of May 1625, Charles was married to a 15-year-old princess, Henrietta Maria, at the doors of the Notre Dame in Paris. Charles, now king, was buoyant, but if only the same could be said of his parliament. Many were against the fact he had married a Roman Catholic. They feared it would lift restrictions on the recusants and undermine the Reformed Church of England. But thoughts of war with Spain were never far from the minds of Charles or Parliament. A land war was out of the question. A naval war would be more attractive and less expensive. So Charles continued to stir the melting pot, and eventually Parliament granted him £140,000. But this was a meagre sum, if in fact war was what Charles really desired.
Under the leadership of Buckingham, England set out for Spain, but it was once again a poorly conceived naval expedition. The problem was not the navy, but the leadership. In May 1625, Buckingham had been nominated as Chancellor by Charles, but two men, Dudley Digges and Sir John Eliot, were arrested for not showing the love their king expected. But the Commons would rise up, and within a week they were both released. On the 12th of June 1626, the Commons launched a challenge attacking Buckingham and stating,
"We protest before your Majesty and the whole world, that until this great person be removed from intermeddling with the great affairs of state, we are out of hope of any good success. And do fear that any money we shall or can give will, through his misemployment, be turned rather to the hurt and prejudice of this your kingdom than otherwise. As by lamentable experience we have found those large supplies formerly and lately given."
Despite Parliament's protests, however, Charles refused to dismiss his friend, but dismissed Parliament instead.
Meanwhile, in the domestic household of Charles and Henrietta, arguments became the norm and had started to affect their marriage. These would involve disputes over a jointure, appointments to the household, and the practice of a religion. Charles by now had taken enough, and his way out of this was to remove most of her French attendants from court. Even this move didn't really help Charles, who was now struggling to come to terms with just about everything, and another major hiccup in his reign saw him go against previously agreed measures with France as conditions set out when he married Henrietta. It would be in 1627 he launched an attack on the French coast to defend the Huguenots at La Rochelle. The action, led by, well, you guessed it, Buckingham, was ultimately unsuccessful. Buckingham's failure to protect the Huguenots and retreat from Saint-Martin-d'Auray spurred Louis XIII's siege of La Rochelle and furthered the English Parliament's and people's abhorrence towards the Duke.
Further unrest was to follow when Charles had sought to raise money with a forced loan, created without parliamentary backing. In 1627, the Five Knights case found that the king had an exclusive right to imprison without trial those who refused to pay the forced loan. This obviously went down well. A further bill was raised in 1628, and this time Parliament adopted a petition of right, stopping any unlawful martial law and deny any imprisonment without a due process. Charles agreed, but then after further thought once again prorogued Parliament and reasserted his rights to collect duties without outside interference. 1628 was to be a calamitous year for Charles. He would lose the one man who he treasured above anyone else. Buckingham was assassinated, and although Charles grieved, the general public were absolutely over the moon by this news. But this was not a good time for Charles. He was losing public favour, something any king should never try to attain. Buckingham's death did end the war with Spain, but his own personal battle with his parliament was set to continue.
Charles, now seemingly under fire from anyone and everyone, at least quelled his domestic attitude towards Henrietta, so much so that she fell pregnant and their bond grew. Now Charles, whose morals were always questionable, was seeming to take a different route and portraying himself as a family man with virtues and, dare I say, integrity. By 1629, Charles reopened the second session of the English Parliament, which had been prorogued in June 1628. He gave a speech on the tonnage and poundage issue, and once again the members of the House erupted. Many viewed the tax as a breach to the Petition of Right, but Charles marched on and adjourned Parliament. It was on the 2nd of March members held the Speaker, Sir John Finch, down in his chair so that the ending of the session could be delayed long enough for resolutions against what they believed to be the main issues of the day to be read out and acclaimed by the Chamber. It was all too much for Charles. He had 9 parliamentary leaders arrested, which did nothing more than create them as martyrs and gave more support to their cause.
It doesn't get any better. The kingdom was in turmoil, and now without any way to raise in funds and no help from Buckingham, Charles signed a peace treaty with France. The next 11 years he ruled without a parliament, and this action has been referred to as the 11-year tyranny. Charles had no funds. His piggy bank was empty, so how could he wage war with no finance? The country had a deficit and little to no chance of competing financially with others. He had to rely on volunteer forces for defence and on diplomatic efforts for everything else.
England was still the least taxed country in Europe, with no official excise and no regular direct taxation. So to raise revenue without reconvening Parliament, Charles resurrected an all but forgotten law called the Distraint of Knighthood. It was a law that had been in the wilderness for over a century. This required any man who earned £40 or more from land each year to present himself at the King's coronation to be knighted. Charles then fined individuals who had failed to attend his coronation in 1626. This was another failure, and by 1640, Charles was now deep in debt and facing bankruptcy.
Charles had made important concessions in England and temporarily improved his position in Scotland by securing the favour of the Scots on a visit from August to November in 1641, during which he conceded to the official establishment of the Presbyterians. However, following an attempted royalist coup in Scotland known as the Incident, Charles's credibility was significantly undermined. Things didn't improve after the Irish Rebellion, when rumours reached Charles that Parliament intended to impeach his wife for supposedly conspiring with the Irish rebels. The king now decided to take some drastic action. On the 3rd of January 1642, Charles directed Parliament to give up 5 members of the Commons: Pym, John Hampden, Denzil Holles, William Strode and Sir Arthur Haselrig, and 1 peer, Lord Mandeville, on the grounds of high treason. When Parliament refused, it was possibly Henrietta Maria who persuaded Charles to arrest the 5 members by force, which Charles intended to carry out personally. However, news of the warrant reached Parliament ahead of him, and the wanted men slipped away by boat.
The botched arrest attempt was politically disastrous for Charles. No English sovereign had ever entered the House of Commons, and his unprecedented invasion of the Chamber to arrest its members was considered a grave breach of parliamentary privilege. In one stroke, Charles had destroyed his supporters' efforts to portray him as a defence against modernisation and anarchy.
Parliament quickly seized London, and Charles fled the capital for Hampton Court Palace on the 10th of January, moving 2 days later to Windsor Castle. After sending his wife and eldest daughter to safety abroad in February, he travelled northwards, hoping to seize the military arsenal at Hull, and to his dismay he was rebuffed by the town's parliamentary governor, Sir John Hotham, who refused him entry in April, and Charles was forced to withdraw.
In mid-1642, civil war was now on the table and both sides began to arm. Charles raised an army using the medieval method of commission of array, and Parliament called for volunteers for its militia. After a few skirmishes, the opposing forces met in earnest at Edgehill on the 23rd of October 1642. Charles's nephew, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, disagreed with the strategic battle plans of the royalist commander, Lord Lindsay, and Charles sided with Rupert. Lindsay resigned, leaving Charles to assume overall command, assisted by Lord Forth. The battle ended inconclusively as the daylight faded. These were now dark days for Charles, and the light was dimming faster than even he could have imagined.
There was no great breakthrough from either side over the coming years. Battles at Crowpreddy Bridge, in which the Royalists gained an upper hand, were completely lost a few days later when they suffered defeat at the Battle of Marston Moor. The Battle of Naseby could be said to be a turning point, as it was now that the parliamentary warhorse was gaining traction, which forced Charles to escape under a very darkening cloud. He arrived at the doorstep of the Scottish Presbyterian Army. 9 months of negotiations took place before a sum of £100,000 was paid for him to be returned to the parliamentary commissioners in January 1647.
Charles was now desperate. He was placed under house arrest and eventually transferred to Hampton Court. Negotiations continued, but these proved to be useless. By November, it was said his best chance was to escape, with France as one option. After removing himself from Hampton Court, he made his way to Southampton and made contact with Colonel Robert Hammond, a parliamentary governor of the Isle of Wight, whom he apparently believed to be sympathetic.
Hammond showed no remorse and threw Charles into Carisbrooke Castle, while informing Parliament that he was now in custody. Although Charles tried to talk his way out, his demise was now almost complete. One last hope was firmly extinguished on the 5th of December 1648, when Parliament voted by 129 to 83 to continue negotiating with the King. But Oliver Cromwell and the army opposed any further talks with someone they viewed as a bloody tyrant, and were already taking action to consolidate their power. Charles was moved to Hurst Castle at the end of 1648 and then to Windsor Castle. In January 1649, the House of Commons indicted him on a charge of treason, which was initially rejected by the House of Lords. The idea of trying a king was certainly novel, yet it transpired. The Rump Commons declared itself capable of legislating alone and passed a bill creating a separate court for Charles's trial, and declared the bill an act without the need for royal assent. Charles was accused of treason against England by using his power to pursue his personal interest rather than the good of the country. The charge was then read out.
For accomplishment of such his designs, and for the protecting of himself and his adherents in his and their wicked practices, to the same ends hath traitorously and maliciously levied war against the present Parliament, and the people therein represented. And that the wicked designs, wars, and evil practices of him, the said Charles Stuart, have been, and are carried on for the advancement and upholding of a personal interest of will, power, and pretended prerogative to himself and his family, against the public interest, common right, liberty, justice, and peace of the people of this nation.
The trial began and Charles was asked several times to plead, yet he refused, and said,
I would know by what power I am called hither, by what lawful authority. No court has jurisdiction over a monarch. My own authority to rule has been given to me by God and by the traditional laws of England, and that the power wielded by those trying me was only that of force of arms. No earthly power can justly call me in question as a delinquent. This day's proceeding cannot be warranted by God's laws, for, on the contrary, the authority of obedience unto kings is clearly warranted, and strictly commanded in both the Old and New Testament. For the law of this land, I am no less confident, that no learned lawyer will affirm that an impeachment can lie against a king, they all going in his name, and one of their maxims is that the king can do no wrong. The higher house is totally excluded, and for the House of Commons, it is too well known that the major part of them are detained or deterred from sitting. The arms I took up were only to defend the fundamental laws of this kingdom against those who have supposed my power, which hath totally changed the ancient government.
Although Charles's words were coherent, they were also scorned upon. He was clearly now at the end. He was removed from court, and at which point 30 witnesses took the stand. All showed contempt and had many grievances. Finally, the court came to a verdict on the 26th of January and condemned him to death. It would be the following day the king was brought before a public session of the commission, declared guilty, and sentenced. Charles' execution was set for Tuesday, 30th of January 1649. Two of his children remained in England under the control of the parliamentarians Elizabeth and Henry, but they were permitted to visit him on the 29th of January, on which he said his tearful farewell.
Under guard from St James's Palace, where he had been confined, he took the walk to the Palace of Whitehall, where an execution scaffold had been erected in front of the banqueting house. Charles was separated from spectators by large ranks of soldiers, and now his inevitable release from life was nearing. He spoke one last time, a speech that could only be heard from atop the scaffold.
An unjust sentence that I suffered to take effect, is punished now by an unjust sentence on me. I declare that I had desired the liberty and freedom of the people as much as any, but I must tell you that their liberty and freedom consists in having government. It is not their having a share in the government, that is nothing appertaining unto them. A subject and a sovereign are clean different things. I shall go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be.
At about 2 p.m, Charles put his head on the block after saying a prayer and signalled the executioner when he was ready by stretching out his hands. He was then beheaded with one clean stroke. According to observer Philip Henry, a moan as I have never heard before and desire I may never hear again rose from the assembled crowd, some of whom then dipped their handkerchiefs in the king's blood as a memento.
The Commission refused to allow Charles's burial at Westminster Abbey, so his body was conveyed to Windsor on the night of 7th of February. He was buried in private on the 9th of February 1649 in the Henry VIII vault in the chapel's choir, alongside the coffins of Henry VIII and Henry's third wife Jane Seymour in St George's Chapel, Windsor Castle.
With the monarchy now overthrown, England became a republic. The House of Lords was abolished by the Rump Commons and executive power was assumed by a Council of State. Further military forces opposed to Britain and Ireland were removed by Oliver Cromwell. It would become the Third English Civil War and the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland. Cromwell dissolved the Rump Parliament in 1653 and established himself as Lord Protector, and when he died in 1658 he was briefly succeeded by his feeble son Richard, but he didn't last long. Parliament was reinstated and the monarchy was restored to Charles I's eldest son, Charles II, in 1660.
Charles I had a life full of controversy and dispute. His own material belief in that he was far better than anyone else didn't resonate well with his court, his parliamentarians, or the general public. It was as though everything he did was so badly planned and thought out. It became unimaginable that this man could not even keep peace within his own house, never mind on a national or international basis. He had been criticised for his unpopular friendship with George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, whose powers were used to grant favour. All this at the detriment of other nobility. His appreciation of money also left a stain on his character, made much worse by his inability to gather funds to protect the nation at times of conflict. His subjects were always suspicious of what he might do next. Parliament was dissolved on 3 occasions during his reign, forcing a position to raise revenue via non-parliamentary means. Again, another nail in his coffin. His religious beliefs also had next to no benefits. There was a crackdown on Puritans and Catholics, and many emigrated to the American colonies. With unrest in Scotland because Charles attempted to force a new prayer book on the country, he was forced to call Parliament to obtain funds to fight the Scots. And finally, in November 1641, his ability to cloud the ever murky waters continued when an uprising in Ireland began. This would once again ultimately end in defeat for Charles. He surrendered, and this time it was absolute. Charles' reign was at the end. He was 49 years old at his death, and it's said that at his time of burial, snow began to fall. The flakes left their white crystals upon his coffin. Some remembered at his coronation how Charles had worn a cloak of white. Maybe this was an omen. Maybe white was the colour of innocence. Yet with sadness, but their faith intact, they lay the White King to finally rest. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. For more amazing stories, join me today and benefit by subscribing, and check out both videos coming up on the screen right now. And I'll see you again soon here on the History Roadshow.